In 70 AD, after a siege marked by starvation and terror crucifixions, the Roman army broke through the walls of Jerusalem. Not only did they kill thousands of Jews, they laid waste to the temple, the only place on earth, according to biblical law, where Jews could worship God. It was the death of the religion of priests and sacrifices, described by the Hebrew Bible. But it would not be the death of Judaism. In the years ahead, some of the greatest religious minds in history would struggle to reinvent the religion of Moses and David. But they would be forced to work during a period of almost inconceivable bloodshed and turmoil. They would watch their people be expelled from Jerusalem on pain of death and see the name of their homeland changed from Judea to Palestine. There would also be a monumental challenge from within, a breakaway form of Judaism called Christianity. But amidst these epic struggles, Judaism would be reborn, and the gifts of the Jews would be preserved for all humankind. When the Romans laid waste to the temple, they destroyed far more than a building. The temple had been the economic, political, and religious heart and soul of Judea and of Judaism. The despair that filled the land after its destruction was captured by the poet Baruch.
Blessed is he who was not born, or he who, having been born, has died. But as for us who live, woe unto us, because we see the afflictions of Zion and what has befallen Jerusalem. Do thou, O sun, withhold the light of thy rays? And do thou, O moon, extinguish the multitude of thy light? For why should light rise again where the light of Zion is darkened?
Jews looking at the destroyed temple must have felt terribly, terribly depressed that their entire ability to worship God, to connect with God, had just been so severely compromised. They had been totally defeated by the Romans. Many of them led off into captivity, and this was really a period of tremendous mourning and the need to begin somehow to deal with this terrible destruction.
The Romans now had Jerusalem and almost all the rest of Judea under their iron fist. All except for one tiny plot of desert southeast of Jerusalem, on the shore of the Dead Sea. At Masada, a fortress built by King Herod, atop a butte overlooking the sea, one rebel group was still holding out against Rome. They were the Sicarii, who were named after the long, thin daggers they carried. At the beginning of the rebellion, they had taken the fortress in a surprise attack. Herod had designed Masada so that a small force could hold it against an enormous army. The historian Josephus described the trail that was the only way to reach the top.
This trail was called the Snake, as resembling that animal in its narrowness and its windings. There is also nothing but destruction in case your feet slip, for on each side there is a deep chasm.
Because the snake was so narrow, a handful of Sicarii had for years been able to beat back every attack by Rome's legions. But then the Romans began to build a ramp that would enable them to reach the top of Masada. For 2 years, the Romans built their ramp. And for 2 years, the Sicarii waited. On the day before the ramp was completed, the leader of the Sicarii, Eleazar ben Yair, told his men they faced an awful choice. If they surrendered, the Romans would crucify them as an example to the would-be rebels throughout their empire. Or they could die fighting and leave their wives and children to rape and slavery. Then he proposed a third alternative. Josephus learned what took place from 2 women who managed to slip away from the fortress.
To avoid the miseries that were to follow from their enemies, they resolved on the necessity of doing their own execution. Miserable men indeed were they whose distress forced them to slay their own wives and children with their own hands. The husbands tenderly embraced their wives and took their children into their arms and gave the longest parting kisses to them with tears in their eyes. Yet at the same time, they did complete that which they had resolved on. Not able to bear the grief they were under for what they had done, and esteeming it an injury to those they had killed to live even the shortest piece of time after them, they then chose 10 men by lot to slay all the rest. And they offered their necks to the stroke of those who executed that melancholy office. And when these 10 men had without fear killed them all, they made the same rule for casting lots for themselves, that he whose lot it was should first kill the other 9, and after all should kill himself. Now, for the Romans, they expected that they should be fought in the morning. But when they made their assault upon the fortress, they saw no enemy, but a terrible solitude on every side.
It is here that tradition of self-imposed martyrdom reaches its most poignant expression. And that is the very eloquent, if heartrending, statement that when I can no longer choose whether or not to die, I can still choose how to die. And that's what inspired the martyrs at Masada to take their own lives rather than to submit to slavery and death under Rome.
In just a few years, most of the groups that had dominated Judea and Judaism for centuries had vanished. The Sicarii and their fellow rebels were all dead. The authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, had also been butchered by the Romans. And with no temple, the priesthood had become meaningless. Just one group remained, the Pharisees. According to the Jewish book of law and tradition, the Talmud, one of the leaders of the Pharisees, Yohanan ben Zakkai, had escaped the siege of Jerusalem by pretending to be dead. Afterward, Yohanan journeyed to a town near the sea called Yavne. In a vineyard there, he set up a primitive school for studying the Hebrew Bible. Eventually, Yohanan and the other teachers would be given a new title, Rabbi.
It was at this point that the Pharisees effectively evolve into what we call the rabbis. That is, this group of lay teachers, which essentially directs the religious activity and the religious study of the Jewish people. And this transition from priest to rabbi, one might say, in terms of the leadership of Jewish life, is one of those things that marks Judaism in the period after the temple.
The Talmud says that Yohanan's greatest challenge in keeping Judaism alive was his fellow rabbis' despair over the loss of the temple.
Woe unto us, Rabbi Joshua cried out, that the place where the iniquities of Israel were atoned for is laid waste. My son, Rabbi Yohanan said to him, be not grieved. We have another atonement as effective as this. And what is that? It is acts of loving kindness. For as it is written, I desire mercy and not sacrifice.
According to the story, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says that now that the temple has been destroyed, it's in acts of loving kindness, in actions such as burying the dead, caring for the homeless, feeding the hungry. It is in those kinds of actions that the very same goals that are achieved in the temple, that were achieved in the temple, of relating to God, of being in God's presence, that's the way one's in God's presence, by seeing the presence of God in the needy person and reaching out and helping them.
Yohanan had found his answer to the loss of the temple by studying the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. He was following in an ancient tradition. For ever since the long-ago days of exile in Babylon, men eager to learn about God had been discussing the stories and laws of the Bible in meeting places called synagogues. With the temple gone, the rabbis began to rebuild Judaism around the study of the Bible in the synagogue. Here, they debated how biblical law could be applied to living an ethical and compassionate life.
With the destruction of the temple, the synagogue is thrust into this tremendous vacuum, and it has to pick up the slack of lack of access to God through a temple process. And that's where the synagogue now really takes off. Through the medium of prayer, the synagogue will be everything that the temple had to be, but much more.
In the temple, only the priests had been allowed to communicate with God through sacrifice. Now, in the synagogue, rabbis and common people alike talked to God through prayer, a previously little-used practice favored by the writers of the Book of Psalms.
Lord, I am calling. Hurry to me. Listen to me. I am invoking you. My prayers rise like incense, my hands like the evening offering. Lord, set a guard at my mouth, a watcher at the gate of my lips, to let me feel no impulse to do wrong, to snare the godlessness of evildoers.
What emerges is a spiritualized version of Judaism, prayer instead of sacrifice, rabbis instead of priests, synagogue instead of temple. And the great question is, how much of this was consciously organized, formulated by Yochanan ben Zakkai and the people of his generation? It could be that part of this is a retrojection of a later period back onto Yochanan ben Zakkai. But I am convinced that Yochanan was aware of the dilemma of the post-temple period, and very, very keenly try to set up alternatives without ever calling them alternatives. In other words, you have to project a sense of continuity while in practice and in fact you are innovating and setting up alternative lifestyles.
But there was one thing that seemed impossible to replace. The great temple festivals that for centuries had kept people deeply connected to the stories from the Bible. One of the most important festivals had been Passover, which commemorated Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Then the rabbis who followed in Yohanan's footsteps created a new kind of Passover celebration called a Seder. It was celebrated not in the temple with tens of thousands of others, but at home with family and friends.
Well, when the temple is gone, how do you observe Passover? It's there that the Seder was created, which means order. Out of the chaos of not having that animal and its blood to celebrate Passover comes the order of the echo of that event, of telling the story. And so the text that they developed, which is still in use in every Jewish home on Passover Eve, is called the Haggadah, which means the telling.
In order to tell the story of Passover, Jewish families used a lamb bone to represent the lamb whose blood their ancestors had painted on their doorposts in Egypt, so that the angel of death would pass over. And they used unleavened bread to represent the matzo the Israelites had eaten as they fled toward the promised land. At the table during the Seder, one of the adults read the story of the Jews' exodus from Egypt. Then everyone present ate the different Passover foods, each of which symbolized a part of the story.
The great achievement of the sages of Yavne is that they understood that if you no longer had the fires of the altar in Jerusalem, what you had was the story. The temple was no longer. The physical sacrifice was no longer. But the story is eternal. And that's what we keep.
Slowly, in a process that would take hundreds of years, the rabbis were reinventing Judaism. But even as they worked, the world around them was becoming threatening once again. During the 60 years after the fall of the temple, the Romans and their Jewish subjects lived in an uneasy truce. Many Jews moved to the fertile area around the Sea of Galilee to try and rebuild their lives. But there were some for whom the rebuilding only brought on painful memories of the building they longed to reconstruct most, the temple. In 130 AD, anger at the Roman Emperor Hadrian for refusing to allow the rebuilding of the temple reached the boiling point. Rumors of a new revolt began to spread.
Many Jews continued to consider Roman presence in the land of Israel to be illegitimate. This was the evil empire. It had no business being. Clearly, however, there must have been immediate stimuli to this war, and we're not sure what they were. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, it was Hadrian's attempt at building a pagan city in Jerusalem to be called Aelia Capitolina that threw, as it were, the Jews over the edge and into the abyss of military uprising. Another Roman source claims that it was an attempt by Hadrian to prohibit circumcision of Jewish children. We cannot know, but that would have been, at the very most, it would have been the final push into what must have been a popular resentment of Rome that needed some sort of stimulation.
The rebellion began among a band of outlaws living in the countryside. Their leader was called Simon Bar Kokhba. The Romans had long considered Bar Kokhba merely a thief. But to many of his fellow Jews, he was another in a long line of freedom fighters who had refused to accept Roman rule.
Bar Kokhba was a Jew like the Zealots, like the defenders of Masada, who was willing to take up arms against Roman occupation and was willing to fight for Jewish sovereignty and, in fact, for a limited period of time, achieved sovereignty. We can hold in our hands the coinage that Bar Kokhba issued in his own kingdom, the last kingdom of Jewish sovereignty for another 2,000 years.
Rather than confront the mighty Roman legions from a great city like Jerusalem, as in the last uprising, Bar Kokhba came up with a plan for a guerrilla war. A Roman historian described Bar Kokhba's preparation for the revolt.
They occupied caves in the countryside and strengthened them in order that they might have places of refuge whenever they should be hard-pressed. And they pierced subterranean passages from above at intervals to let in air and light.
As plans for a rebellion began to leak out, rumors raced through the region that Bar Kokhba was the messianic leader foretold in the Bible, who would lead the Jewish people to freedom.
His name meant star, and he claimed to be a luminary who had come down to them from heaven and was magically enlightening those who were in misery.
Simeon Bar Kokhba, as we now know his name to have really been, is called Bar Kokhba, son of a star, because there was a prophecy in the Bible that spoke of a star as a symbolic name for a messianic figure. Now, this fellow Bar Kokhba was a tremendous military leader who between 132 to 5 almost kicked the Romans out of Judea, and in fact caused many, many Roman soldiers to be killed in the prolonged battles of the revolt that he had brought into being. But the key point to realize is that the Bar Kokhba revolt was a messianic revolt in which people entered into the revolt believing firmly that the Messiah would come if they would be victorious.
Bar Kokhba's charismatic leadership appealed to not just peasants and craftsmen, but also scholars and sages. Their fervor was stoked by certain prophecies in the Bible, which they believed said this was the precise moment in history God had chosen for the temple to be rebuilt.
Just as the first temple at one point lay in ruins and was rebuilt, so too will the second temple. And they were, in their minds, God's agents. They were going to defeat the Romans. And the third temple was going to descend from the sky like a prefab, completely built right on that same spot. And that was, in a sense, its messianic mission, that they were doing God's will to throw off the evil empire. That's what God wanted.
In 132 AD, the most prominent rabbi in Judea publicly declared that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah. The ranks of the rebels swelled even more. With hundreds of thousands now ready to follow him, Bar Kokhba nevertheless remained patient. In order to lull Hadrian and his legions into a false sense of security, he counseled his followers to pretend to be happy and peaceful.
So long indeed as Hadrian was close by in Egypt, the Jews remained quiet. Except that they made the weapons which the Romans demanded of them as tribute of such poor quality that the Romans rejected them. By this ruse, they were able to have use of these weapons themselves.
In a strategic masterstroke, Bar Kokhba bided his time until Hadrian was well on his way back to Rome. Then, suddenly, he launched the revolt. In the early days of the rebellion, the rebels inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on the Romans.
In the ancient world, Jews were not known as bookish and prayerful and pious. They were known as ruthless and ferocious fighters. They were highly prized as mercenary soldiers, and they showed in the uprising against Rome exactly how effective they were on the field of battle.
The stunning success of the rebels forced the Romans to withdraw from the region. Bar Kokhba then declared Judea to be an independent kingdom. But the Romans were merely waiting to counterattack until they had assembled one of the greatest armies in their history. They had sent 3 legions against Jerusalem in the rebellion 60 years earlier. Now they sent 13.
Hadrian sent against the Jews his best general, Julius Severus, who was dispatched from Britain. Hadrian ordered him to put to the sword all who stood in their paths.
Rome responds to Bar Kokhba by throwing masses of its military force into the fray. Legions would be brought in not only from Judea, from Egypt, from the surrounding countries, but as far as across the Danube River. A commander would be brought in from Britain. There was absolutely no way that Hadrian could allow even partial success to this uprising.
Severus did not venture to attack his opponents in the open, in view of their numbers and their desperation. Instead, he isolated them in small groups. They dispensed with the rebels who were hiding in their caves by filling them with smoke and guarding the exits. Then they surprised and killed all who came out to fight. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles. And the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and suffocation was past finding out.
With the rebellion crushed, the people of Judea faced even worse retribution from the Romans than after the uprising 60 years earlier. For the Romans now set themselves the goal of wiping the Jews from Judea.
The Bar Kokhba rebellion was known really as the most disastrous single event that ever happened to the Jewish people before the Holocaust. In fact, when we look at the 3 literary accounts, we find that they all agree. Nearly 600,000 Jews were killed. Over 900 Jewish villages were destroyed. And for one small moment in Jewish history, again, it looked like Jewish history might have been over.
In the aftermath of the uprising, the Romans changed the name of the region from Judea to Palestine. Then they banned all Jews from Jerusalem.
The emperor then commanded by legal decree that the whole nation of the Jews should be forcibly removed from the district round Jerusalem, so that not even from a distance could they see their ancestral home. Thus the city came to be bereft of the nation of the Jews, and in honor of the emperor Aelius Hadrian, the name of the city became Aelia.
The outcome of the Bar Kokhba revolt is a much more serious policy on the part of the Romans, prohibiting Jews from even going to Jerusalem, and they plow over the Temple Mount and build a temple to their gods on that spot, thereby showing you have no place here. We clearly are the winners.
In the centuries that followed, whole villages of Jews began to leave Judea in search of a new life. They headed for the Jewish communities that had been flourishing for centuries in Babylon, in Greece, in Rome, and many other places. But in their new homes, they would soon face a challenge to their survival, every bit as daunting as the Romans. This threat would come not from outside, but from within, from a new kind of Judaism called Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth had called his Jewish followers fishers of men. Since his death in 33 AD, they had been telling all who would listen that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, who after his crucifixion had risen from the dead. These Christians did not mourn the loss of the temple and its sacrificial rituals, for they believed God had decided to sacrifice his only Son once and for all. The Christians preached to Jews and Gentiles alike, but their message that a Messiah had come to set the world right was at its heart a Jewish message.
For centuries, Christianity was a type of Judaism. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, one of the ones that's in the New Testament collection, that Jesus gives instructions to his followers on where they should stand when they pray in the synagogue, on how long their tzitziot, their prayer fringes should be, on what they should be like when they fast. I mean, it's all this Jewish stuff. And when you think of it, that makes sense because Christianity is a Jewish movement.
Like many other Jews, the Christians believed the Hebrew Bible was the Word of God, and therefore told the absolute truth. But unlike other Jews, they believed that its most important stories and prophecies foretold the coming of Jesus.
Churchill once said that the Americans and the English are divided by a common language. In the same way, we could say that the early Christians are divided from other groups of Judaism by a common Bible. They're engaged in competition for the interpretation of this sacred scripture.
As the Christians won more and more converts, the competition with other forms of Judaism intensified. Churches sprang up alongside synagogues in Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire. And yet, because of their common roots, most Christians and Jews felt a kinship with one another. But then Christianity gained perhaps the most important convert in its history, a man who was about to become the Roman Emperor. In 320 AD, an army marched to war for the first time beneath a Christian cross. The Roman Empire was in the middle of a civil war between two generals over who would be the next emperor. According to an historian from the time, one of the generals, named Constantine, was inspired by a vision to send his legions into battle carrying a cross.
A most marvelous sign had appeared to him. He saw with his own eyes a cross of light in the heavens, bearing the inscription, "Conquer by this."
With the cross at their head, Constantine's troops were victorious. The story of the Battle of the Cross was spread far and wide throughout the empire to win support for Constantine from the rapidly growing Christian movement.
There's nothing like a voice from heaven to clarify ambiguity. And in the confusing political situation Constantine finds himself in, he and the bishops who are working with him clear up some of the political ambiguity by beginning to talk about voices from heaven or signs from heaven, which at crucial moments in Constantine's political career have indicated who heaven wants to be emperor.
For Jews throughout the empire, the new emperor's alliance with Christianity would prove disastrous. The bishops who allied themselves with Constantine were part of the one branch of Christianity that was hostile toward Jews.
One edge of Gentile Christian culture itself becomes extremely anti-Jewish. And unfortunately, for later history, that particular edge of Gentile Christianity wins the patronage of the Roman Empire.
The anti-Jewish Christian bishops became determined to stamp out the friendship that many Christians felt toward Judaism.
Take John Chrysostom, one of the great preachers of the 4th century. He had trouble because people in his congregation thought that the festivals of the Jews were ever so much more interesting than the things that the church put on, and so they would trot off during the high holy days to visit the synagogues. This infuriated John, so he preached a series of 8 sermons against the Judaizers, in which he first, as far as I know, coined the term the Christ killers in order to label those people that he didn't want his congregation associating with. Obviously, this term then is going to have very fateful after effects in the history of Christian anti-Judaism.
In the centuries ahead, this new prejudice of Christians toward Jews would lead to anti-Jewish laws, violent attacks, and mass evictions. And so the Jews began to search for new homes in North Africa, in Spain, in Russia. But as the Jews became further and further spread out from one another, Judaism was threatened with disintegration. The laws that now governed how a Jew should live, from rituals to social relationships, had never been written down. They existed only in an oral tradition passed from one generation to the next.
In order to have an ongoing oral tradition, you have to have a stable community. How did you know that you needed a driver's license when you were 16 years old? It's not because you read it in the particular state code of your state. It's because somebody told you that you needed a driver's license when you were 16 years old. But that kind of oral tradition requires a stable community. And if the community is disintegrating, as the Jewish community was in Judea from the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 until the end of the 2nd century, there was a very strongly felt need for editing that oral tradition so that it might be preserved.
The monumental work of genius that would enable Judaism to survive anywhere began to take shape in the 2nd century AD in the countryside, in the mind of an illiterate shepherd named Akiva. As Akiva spent day after day observing the natural world around him, questions began to flood into his mind about where it had all come from and what it all meant. And so he taught himself how to read and began to study the Hebrew Bible. According to the Talmud, he was awestruck by the power of the Bible to help him see the world in a whole new way.
Akiva noticed how the stone at a well had been hollowed out by drippings from the buckets. He thought, if these drippings can penetrate this solid stone, how much more can the study of the Word of God penetrate the human heart?
Akiva was a simple shepherd, illiterate, didn't know an aleph from a bet, an A from a B. At the age of 40, discovered that he needed to learn Torah. And so he began to study with 5-year-olds. And he learned Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, and then he learned the entire alphabet. Then he learned the book of Leviticus, and then the entire Torah. And in a few short years, this illiterate shepherd became the leading sage of his age.
Akiva learned that in addition to the Bible, there existed a vast collection of oral traditions passed down to scholars like Hillel and Yohanan ben Zakkai, and passed on by them to Akiva's generation. These teachings about justice, mercy, and how to make them real in one's own life comprised the greatest of all the treasures of the Jews. But because these teachings had been handed down only by word of mouth, they were so disorganized that they were in danger of being lost entirely. Then Akiva began using his remarkable mind to organize the centuries of Jewish tradition and law that had been inspired by the Bible.
Akiva, we are told, may have been the first rabbi to take this enormous mass of oral tradition that had accrued over hundreds and hundreds of years and to systematize it, to create some sort of a thematic structure to this material. We are actually told that Akiva is like a person going to the marketplace and buying these vegetables and those fruits, putting everything in his basket, and then coming home and sorting everything out. And similarly, we are told Akiva sorted out oral tradition. So I think what we have here is a brilliant legal mind who realizes that if this material is going to last many more generations, some sense has to be made out of it. It has to be put in order.
But Akiva lived during difficult times, when Rome and the Jews were battling over the rebuilding of the temple. As a strong supporter of rebellion, Akiva was arrested by the Romans. According to the Talmud, the Romans then condemned Akiva to death. But not just any death. Aware of his fame as the greatest of all sages, they decided to make an example of Akiva to all who would rebel against Rome. They sentenced him to be flayed alive.
As Akiva was given into the hands of the executioner, it was just the time to recite the evening prayer. Though suffering agonies, Akiva recited his prayers calmly, full of devotion. And when he was asked whether he was a sorcerer, since he appeared to feel no pain, Akiva replied, "I am no sorcerer, but I rejoice at the opportunity now given to me to love my God with all my life, seeing that I have hitherto been able to love him only with all my means, and with all my might. And with that word, he died.
He's being taken out to be executed, and his last words are words of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and one should love God with all his heart and all his soul. And the beautiful Talmudic description has his disciples asking him, Akiva, how can you maintain that faith in these circumstances? And he responds by saying, I've been preparing for this all my life. I've been reciting these scriptures all my life, wondering, will I ever have to put up? Will I ever have to actually perform these ultimate acts of faith in a real world? And now that I have the chance to do this, how can I refrain from not really giving up my life for my faith?
Akiva was dead. But the work he had done to make the teachings of the Jews accessible to anyone, anywhere, lived on. Beginning in the 4th century A.D., Akiva's heirs made his work the basis for an ongoing collection of law and tradition called the Talmud. It contained the teachings of scholars down through the ages on how Jews should practice Judaism.
For a Jew to live a proper life and a good life meant that on the one hand there was a set of rituals to be observed, but along with the commandments that are ritual commandments, there came a set of ethical commandments, and these ethical commandments had to be observed and were as important or more important, whether it's the obvious ones, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, or the very not so obvious ones, love your neighbor as yourself, probably the hardest one to do that most of us never really attain. All of these types of beautiful ethics, family relations, relations with husband and wife, with children, with other people, with non-Jews, all of these ethical laws, when taken together with the religious commandments and with the theology of Judaism, together constitute the life the Jew was and is called on to live.
But the Talmud was not just a book of commandments. It was also a record of great debates between sages about how to apply the eternal values of the Hebrew Bible to living here and now.
Abraham was not a person who was just dead for them. Abraham was a living presence. They read the story of Abraham in comparison to the story of Noah. Noah, when he was told that the world was going to be destroyed, they said, in reading the biblical text, they saw that Noah didn't talk to anybody. He just kept to himself. But Abraham, when he heard that Sodom was going to be destroyed, Abraham went out and argues with God and wants to know, will you do this if there are really 50 people who are righteous there? Or 40 people? And from their way of looking at things, these provided, Noah and Abraham, provided two different models of how to live as a human being. Do you just hear a message and keep it to yourself? Or if you hear a message, if it doesn't make sense, do you have the willingness to ask for a clarification or say, that doesn't make sense?
Above all, the Talmud was a how-to book for practicing Judaism. Any community of Jews anywhere could study the lessons of the Bible and then debate among themselves how to apply its laws and traditions to their own time and place. In synagogues from Spain to Russia to North Africa, Jews who were isolated in ghettos could still maintain their connection to their culture and their God.
For instance, a community in Spain, which already existed in late Roman times. On the one hand, isolated, hundreds and hundreds of miles removed both from the land of Israel and from the other center of rabbinic knowledge, Babylonia. But slowly, this Talmudic material in book fashion, as it were, makes its way to Spain. And these Jews can now plug in to this culture. They can plug into this tradition. They can interpret it. They can use what is applicable to their own lifestyles. So in many ways, it's a mobile tradition. The Talmud would become, in many ways, the mobile tradition that reaches all corners of the Jewish world. Nobody now is isolated from the focal point of Jewish religious activity. You have the Talmud, you can study it, you can elaborate, you can interpret, you can ask others what it means. The Talmud now would be the walking Bible and this living Bible for Jews throughout the world.
With the Talmud to bind them together, Jewish communities around the world thrived in spite of the discrimination they faced. And invariably, their Muslim and Christian neighbors soon discovered that the Jews among them possessed unique gifts. One of the skills Jews introduced to country after country was glassblowing. Their neighbors also benefited from the Jewish community's advanced knowledge of medicine and were inspired by its practice of giving every child an education. But most important of all, the Jews brought spiritual gifts.
Among the many contributions that the Jewish people have made to world civilization is this idea that what God demands of ordinary human beings is not merely the observance of a ritual or the holding of a particular belief or credo. It's simply a fierce pursuit of justice. Moses says, "Justice, justice shalt thou pursue." That's one of the credos of the Bible and of rabbinical Judaism, and it is one of the moral gifts of the Jews to posterity. And it finds its expression in both Christianity and Islam and in the world we live in today.
The importance of compassion for the less fortunate, of personal ethics, of laws that apply to everyone equally. These were just some of the gifts of the Jews.
I think that the Jewish tradition has given the world a sense of appreciation for family and for education, of a sense that we are not only supposed to be for ourselves, but also for others, as the rabbis themselves say, and that we have to therefore make sure that we do our bit in making this a better world.
These eternal truths, communicated first through the stories of the Hebrew Bible, had become the unshakable foundation of Judaism. A tiny, insignificant people, seemingly destined to be destroyed by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans, had instead survived and flourished. Not through the power of their weapons, like other great empires, but through the power of their beliefs and their ideas. And in the end, they would have as much impact on who we are and what we believe as any empire in history.